Along the fog-shrouded coastline of Massachusetts, there is a stone marker no one dares approach. It is small, weather-eaten, and silent, yet it holds a secret that has haunted this land for more than 3 centuries. The fishermen who glimpse it at dawn turn their boats away. The locals who pass it avert their eyes. No name should be spoken, yet the names are carved into the stone. Ezekiel and Judith Harrington, siblings who crossed the most forbidden line not for love, but for power. In 1687 they vanished from their manor, leaving behind a scandal whispered in the dark and erased from the history books. Their empire was built on fear, wealth gained from the screams of the accused, the theft of the innocent, the ruin of entire families. But their story does not end with theft or blood. It ends with birth. 2 children who should never have lived. Twins whose bodies were twisted beyond comprehension, yet whose minds shone with an intelligence far too advanced for their years. Some say divine judgment cursed them. Others whisper it was something worse. Tonight, you will know the truth. And once you know, you can never return to who you were before. The Harringtons were not born into power. They built it through something far more insidious. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 1660s, suspicion was currency, and fear could be turned into gold. Ezekiel, with his piercing grey eyes, projected authority. Judith, with her calculated whispers, planted doubt like seeds in barren soil. Together they became architects of accusation, turning neighbour against neighbour, weaving stories of witchcraft that ended with a rope and a scaffold. They understood the game better than anyone else. Accuse the vulnerable, confiscate their land, and cloak their greed in righteousness. They were not the first to exploit hysteria, but they perfected it. 57 people, many of them widows and landowners, were destroyed to feed the Harrington fortune. But what separated Ezekiel and Judith from ordinary predators was the pact they made in secret. They were bound not just by blood, but by the hunger to keep every coin, every field, every stolen acre within their grasp. So, when the question of inheritance threatened to unravel their empire, they chose a path so dark that even their allies recoiled. They married one another, not in love, but in a calculated act of possession, and from that union came horror. The marriage of Ezekiel and Judith was never meant to be seen. It happened on the longest night of the year, December 21st, 1675, the winter solstice. In the basement of their manor, by candlelight, a corrupt minister bound them in secrecy. No rings, no witnesses, save for 2 servants threatened into silence. No prayers of love or vows of devotion, only a legal maneuver, a ritual designed to fuse their empire into a single bloodline. The siblings knew what they were doing was forbidden in the eyes of both church and nature, but to them, morality was nothing but a cage for weaker minds. They sought something higher than law, something older than scripture, the cold permanence of power. Their unholy wedding was never about survival, it was about immortality. If their blood remained unbroken, then so would their fortune. And yet, beneath the polished words and calculated strategy, they had unknowingly invited a curse older than Puritan law. For nature remembers, blood remembers. And when their union produced children, it did not bless them with heirs. It condemned them with reflections of their own corruption. 2 beings twisted in flesh, but sharpened in mind, destined to turn against their creators. At first, Judith's pregnancy seemed normal. The Harringtons spared no expense bringing in a skilled midwife from Boston, feeding her on imported delicacies, ensuring her every need was met. Matching mahogany cradles were carved, silk bedding prepared, as though wealth alone could bribe nature into compliance. But by the 7th month, something stirred within her womb that terrified even seasoned hands. The midwife pressed her palm against Judith's belly and froze. The movements inside were not like the kicks of ordinary children. They were violent, coordinated, 2 lives locked in combat before they had even taken breath. "They are fighting each other," she whispered to her assistant. Ezekiel dismissed it as superstition, but behind his cold eyes, doubt gnawed. He scoured medical texts, consulted London physicians, and discovered whispers of the truth. Children of close kinship, bore risks, stillbirths, deformities, minds clouded by madness. Yet none of those warnings could prepare them for what came. On March 15, 1677, after 2 days of agony, Judith birthed twins that horrified even the most hardened eyes. Their bodies bent at impossible angles, limbs fused by bridges of flesh, skulls crowned with unnatural ridges. But their eyes, alive, searching, aware, stared back with something no infant should possess: understanding. The Harrington twins, Gabriel and Raphael, were not supposed to live. Children born with such deformities rarely survived their first days, yet these two clung to life with unsettling determination. By their first year, it became clear they were not ordinary infants. Their bodies, twisted and pained, failed them in ways that demanded constant care. But their minds, God help their minds, developed at a speed no one could explain. At 4, they were reading scripture and legal records left unattended in their parents' study. At 5, they corrected hands-on mathematics, scrawling numbers with trembling hands that could barely hold a quill. By 7, they debated questions of philosophy and morality with a precision that unsettled even the most learned visitors. The more their bodies failed, the sharper their minds became, as though nature had chosen to compensate. Yet their brilliance carried something darker: awareness. They understood the stares of disgust, the whispers of judgment, and most damning of all, they understood what their parents were. Kept in isolation inside the manor, they listened, they absorbed, and they learned every vile detail of the empire Ezekiel and Judith had built on blood. By their 8th birthday, they no longer saw their parents as protectors. They saw them as architects of damnation. The Harrington twins were prisoners in their own home. Their parents told neighbors it was to protect them from ridicule, but the truth was simpler. Ezekiel and Judith feared what the children represented. To let anyone see them was to invite whispers of divine judgment, a crack in their carefully manufactured image of piety. Yet, in that isolation, Gabriel and Raphael developed something their parents never anticipated: strategy. The children learned to remain perfectly still, their twisted bodies feigning helplessness, while their sharp ears absorbed every whispered plot, every calculation of stolen land, every plan to manufacture accusations. Ezekiel and Judith assumed their children too broken to understand. But in truth, the twins were building a ledger of sins in their minds, cataloguing every crime. And with each revelation, their resentment sharpened into purpose. They did not see themselves as cursed victims. They saw themselves as instruments forged by corruption to destroy corruption. By candlelight, they scratched secret notes, crude but legible, teaching themselves to communicate in ways their parents would never detect. Their hatred had found its shape. They would not run. They would not beg for mercy. They would dismantle the Harrington Empire from within, piece by piece, word by word. In the summer of 1685, opportunity arrived in the form of a young woman named Margaret Caldwell. She came to the manor seeking employment as a servant, carrying only grief and hunger. Years earlier, her father, Thomas Caldwell, had been accused of witchcraft and executed. What Margaret never knew was that it was Ezekiel and Judith who had orchestrated his death to steal his forge and land. To her, the Harringtons were powerful patrons who could offer survival. To the twins, she was destiny. At first, her duties were simple: cleaning, carrying, maintaining silence. But soon, she began to notice things: a whisper behind closed doors, ledgers locked away with unusual care, and above all, the strange, brilliant children hidden upstairs. Gabriel and Raphael studied her as she moved through the manor. They saw in her eyes the flicker of sorrow that matched their own. And so, they chose her. Crude notes, written in shaky hands, began appearing where only she would find them, tucked beneath candle holders, hidden in laundry baskets, folded inside books she dusted, notes that spoke of secrets, ledgers, evidence of blood-soaked crimes. At first she dismissed them as childish ramblings, but soon she realized the impossible. The twins were warning her, and guiding her. The messages grew bolder. At first, they pointed Margaret to suspicious records, ledgers tucked beneath loose floorboards, scraps of parchment burned halfway in the hearth. Then the instructions became precise. Behind the study wall. One night, while the Harringtons entertained guests, Margaret slipped into Ezekiel's office. There, exactly as the twins had written, she found a false panel. Inside were ledgers that chilled her to the bone. Every execution, every accusation, every confiscated property, recorded not as tragedy but as profit. Names, dates, values, payments to bribed witnesses. Entire families reduced to numbers in neat, meticulous ink. She realized then what the Harringtons truly were, not defenders of the colony, not witch-finders, but predators feeding on fear. And yet, the horror deepened when she saw the annotations in the margins. Plans, strategies, notes in Judith's careful hand about future targets, about who would be most profitable to accuse next. Margaret's blood ran cold. She was living among monsters, but the twins' notes had not just revealed corruption. They had given her a choice. She could remain silent, surviving as countless others had under tyranny. Or she could act, carrying evidence of crimes powerful enough to burn the Harrington name from history. She chose the second path. Margaret knew she could not fight alone. If she fled with the evidence, the Harringtons would hunt her down. If she accused them openly, they would turn their machine of fear against her, as they had done to 57 before her. But whispers reached her of a man unlike the others, a Jesuit priest newly arrived from France, Father Benedict Thorne, learned, sharp-eyed, and unafraid of powerful families. He had already begun questioning the excesses of witch trials in Boston, calling them not justice, but theatre for profit. To Margaret, he was the only hope. Under cover of night, she smuggled out fragments of copied records hidden in her apron seams. She approached the priest not with accusations, but with questions, testing his courage, probing his faith. And when she finally placed before him the damning words of Ezekiel and Judith's own hand, Father Thorne's face turned pale. Here was no rumor, no suspicion. It was proof of systematic evil, stretching back decades. The priest understood instantly. He was staring into the machinery of corruption itself. Margaret had carried him the keys to expose it, but the Harringtons were not mere criminals. They were predators who had survived by outmaneuvering everyone. This would be war. Father Benedict Thorne arrived at Harrington Manor on a rain-soaked afternoon, dressed in modest black, his crucifix glinting faintly in the gloom. Ezekiel welcomed him with forced politeness, suspicious of his presence but unwilling to risk offending the church. Judith, ever the strategist, served wine and played the role of dutiful hostess. But in the silence between their words, Thorne felt it, the heaviness of a house built on lies. His sharp eyes wandered, cataloguing details, the concealed ledgers behind the study wall, the bruised look of servants trained to silence, the unnatural stillness in the upstairs rooms. And then he saw them, the twins, brought down at their parents' insistence to prove they were well. Their bodies twisted, their movements painful, but their gaze, it unsettled him. Gabriel and Raphael studied the priest with eyes far older than their years, eyes that almost seemed to ask, "Do you see it too?" When Thorne addressed them in Latin, testing them, their response was flawless, even elegant. Ezekiel laughed nervously, dismissing it as rote memorization. But Thorne knew better. These children were not only brilliant, they were dangerous to their parents, for they had learned too much. As he left, his decision was sealed. He would bring the Harringtons down, no matter the cost. It began with whispers. Ezekiel noticed that certain ledgers seemed touched, as if someone had handled them when he was away. Judith sensed unease among the servants, a tension in the air whenever her shadow passed. And then came the final straw. Ezekiel caught Margaret returning late from the village, her apron damp, her hands trembling. He said nothing at first, but suspicion bloomed like rot. For years, the Harringtons had built their empire by reading fear, and now they saw it in her eyes. Judith pressed her husband. "Someone has opened the walls of this house." The twins, brought again before their parents, sat in silence, their sharp eyes betraying nothing, but Ezekiel could not shake the thought that his own blood might be betraying him. He remembered the midwife's words years ago, that the children were fighting each other, even in the womb. Perhaps that fight was not against each other, but against their makers. The Harringtons tightened their grip. They doubled the locks, restricted movement, interrogated servants one by one. Margaret felt the noose tightening, every glance from Judith a dagger. Yet in secret, the twins reassured her with hidden notes. Do not falter. They are watching, but they are afraid. Judith Harrington had survived too long to be outmaneuvered easily. Where others saw suspicion, she saw opportunity. If someone had indeed betrayed them, then better to draw the serpent from its hole than strike blindly. She whispered her plan to Ezekiel. Bait the priest, bait the servant, make them reveal themselves. The Harringtons announced a sudden charity gathering, inviting clergy and select neighbors under the guise of piety. A feast to honor the church, with Father Benedict Thorne placed at the guest of honor's seat. Margaret, forced to serve, felt her blood run cold the moment she heard the announcement. The twins, locked in their chamber, scratched frantic warnings onto scraps of cloth, slipped through floorboards where she would find them. They know, do not eat, do not drink. They will poison before they are exposed. On the night of the gathering, candles burned low, the smell of roasted meat heavy in the air. Father Thorne entered, composed but cautious, his eyes flicking to Margaret, then to the children's absence. Judith moved through the hall like a queen, her smile a mask of honey. Every goblet of wine shimmered with an unseen sheen. It was not a feast. It was a trap. The feast began with prayers and false piety. Judith raised her goblet high, her voice smooth as silk, praising God for mercy while concealing murder in her hand. Servants carried platters heavy with food, and Margaret, trembling, placed goblets before the guests. Her heart thundered as she remembered the twins' warning, do not drink. She met Father Thorne's eyes. He understood. He raised his glass to his lips, but at the last moment he set it down untouched, offering a blessing instead. Judith's smile flickered. Something had gone wrong. Then came the moment no one expected. A sound, high, sharp, almost like a wail, echoed from upstairs. The twins. Locked in their room, they had found a way to force themselves into the gathering. Servants gasped as the sound grew louder, no longer a cry, but words. Latin verses, recited with terrifying precision, echoing through the manor as though the walls themselves spoke. Guests froze, fear rippling through them. For the Puritan mind, such a voice was no ordinary child. It was a sign, perhaps even a curse. Judith's hand tightened around her goblet until it cracked. Ezekiel's face drained of color. Their empire of fear had relied on silence, and now their own children had torn the silence apart. Panic spread through the hall like fire in dry grass. The guests looked to one another, whispering prayers, their faces pale as the twins' voices carried down from the upper chamber. The verses were unmistakable. Condemnations from Scripture twisted into warnings of blood and judgment. The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children, Gabriel intoned. The wages of sin is death, Raphael followed. For the faithful gathered in the manor, it was not the voice of children, but of prophecy. Father Thorne rose, his hand firm upon the table, and spoke with the clarity of a blade. What you hear is truth. This house is not blessed. It is damned. And here lies the proof. From his cloak he produced the copied ledgers Margaret had smuggled out, laying them open before all. Names, dates, values, evidence of corruption too great to ignore. Gasps broke out, and men crossed themselves in fear. Judith leapt to her feet shouting, "Lies!" while Ezekiel tried to snatch the records, but the damage was done. The guests no longer saw them as pious arbiters of justice. They saw predators unmasked. Servants backed away, refusing to shield their masters. The Harringtons' power, built on fear, was crumbling in an instant. The Harringtons were cornered animals, and cornered animals bite. Ezekiel drew the dagger he kept hidden in his coat, his face twisted with fury. "You think ink and paper can unmake me?" he snarled, lunging across the table toward Father Thorn. The priest sidestepped, the blade sinking into the oak where moments before his chest had been. Screams erupted. Judith, her mask of civility gone, seized a pitcher of poisoned wine and hurled it into the crowd. The acrid stench filled the air as it splattered across startled guests who stumbled back in horror. Servants fled, trampling dishes underfoot. Margaret tried to run, but Judith caught her by the hair, dragging her across the floor. "You," Judith hissed, her eyes blazing, "you opened the walls of this house." Margaret clawed and kicked, but the mistress's grip was iron. Upstairs, the twins screamed in unison, their voices rising not in prophecy, but in rage, shaking the very timbers. Then, crash. A window shattered as Gabriel and Raphael hurled themselves into sight, broken bodies twisted but defiant. For the first time, all saw them, not as monsters, but as children betrayed by their own blood. That moment of revelation was enough. Father Thorn struck, knocking Ezekiel to the ground. By dawn, Harrington Manor lay in ruin, not just physically, but morally. Ezekiel and Judith, broken, bleeding, stripped of their power, could no longer command fear. The guests had fled, carrying word of crimes too monstrous to ignore. The twins, Gabriel and Raphael, though scarred and twisted, stood at the center of the chaos, their intelligence and cunning surviving where corruption had died. Margaret, bruised but alive, handed Father Thorn the final ledgers, the irrefutable proof of decades of calculated murder and greed. Colonial authorities would arrive soon, but the Harringtons' empire had already crumbled in that night of revelation. What remained was a lesson carved into the bones of history. No secret, no matter how carefully protected, can escape the vigilance of those who see clearly. The twins, condemned by birth, had become the instruments of justice, their deformities a mirror of their parents' corruption, and their brilliance a weapon no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Outside, the fog rolled in from the Atlantic, carrying whispers of what had transpired within the manor, whispers that would haunt Massachusetts for generations. And in the shadows, one could almost hear the twins' final message. Unspoken but clear: power built on fear and blood is never permanent. It bends, it breaks, and eventually it dies.